The rain fell like broken promises that night, cold and merciless, as 12-year-old Marcus Chen pressed his face against the window of his father's hospital room. Inside, machines beeped their monotonous rhythm, counting down moments that felt like grains of sand slipping through desperate fingers. His father, the brilliant tech CEO who had built empires and changed lives, lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old newspapers. The doctors had delivered their verdict with clinical detachment. Experimental treatment, unavailable in the country, $500,000, maybe 3 weeks to arrange it all. Maybe. Marcus had never felt so powerless, so small, so utterly alone despite being surrounded by his father's expensive lawyers and distant relatives who spoke in hushed tones about inheritance and estate planning. They saw dollar signs where Marcus saw the man who taught him to ride a bike, who read him stories every night no matter how late the board meetings ran, who promised they'd hike the Appalachian Trail together next summer. Next summer. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He couldn't stay in that room anymore, couldn't watch his father fade like a photograph left in the sun. Marcus slipped past the nurse's station, ignoring his aunt's calls, and found himself on the streets of downtown Seattle. The rain had driven most people indoors, but the city never truly slept. Steam rose from subway grates, neon signs flickered their electric prayers, and somewhere a saxophone played a mournful blues that seemed to score his misery perfectly. That's when he saw him. A boy, maybe a year or two older than Marcus, was crouched beneath the overhang of a closed bodega, sorting through a cardboard box of what looked like discarded electronics. His clothes were 3 sizes too big, held together with safety pins and hope. His face was smudged with dirt, but his eyes, those eyes were sharp, alert, taking in everything with the wariness of someone who'd learned young that the world wasn't kind to kids like him. Marcus didn't know what possessed him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the way the boy looked up at that exact moment, and their eyes met across the rain-slicked street. Maybe it was simply that he needed to say the words out loud to someone, anyone, who wasn't counting his father's money before he was even gone. He crossed the street, his expensive sneakers splashing through puddles, and stopped in front of the boy. "Please," Marcus heard himself say, his voice cracking. "Please save my father." The street kid, he'd later learn his name was Danny Rodriguez, stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Then his expression shifted, cycling through confusion, suspicion, and finally settling on something that might have been pity. "Kid, I can barely save myself," Danny said, his voice rougher than his years suggested. "You got the wrong guy." But Marcus was crying now, the words spilling out in a torrent. He told this stranger everything. About the experimental treatment in Switzerland, about the money they needed, about how his father had 3 weeks at most. He told him about the relatives who'd already written his father off, about the lawyers who spoke about realistic expectations, about how everyone kept patting his shoulder and telling him to be strong, when all he wanted was someone to tell him it would be okay. Danny listened, which was more than most adults had done. When Marcus finally ran out of words and stood there shaking, soaked through from the rain he hadn't even noticed, Danny did something unexpected. He reached into his box and pulled out a battered smartphone with a cracked screen. "Your dad, he's Ryan Chen, right? The guy who started Tech Bridge." Marcus nodded, surprised. The street kid knew. "My mom used to work in one of his factories," Danny said quietly. "Before she got sick. Before everything went to hell. He was the only boss who ever treated her like a person. When she was in the hospital, someone from his company sent flowers every week. We never knew who." His jaw tightened. "She died anyway, but those flowers, man. They meant something." He stood up, and Marcus realized Danny was taller than him, though probably weighed less. There was a hardness to him, a kind of strength forged in circumstances Marcus couldn't imagine. "I can't save your dad," Danny said. "But maybe I can help you try." What happened next would have been impossible to predict. Danny, it turned out, wasn't just surviving on the streets, he was thriving in the city's underground economy. He knew people. More importantly, he knew the kind of people who existed in the cracks of society, the ones who traded in favors and information, who operated outside the conventional systems that had failed them both. Over the next 72 hours, Danny became Marcus's guide through a Seattle he never knew existed. They visited a hacktivist collective operating out of a condemned building, where Danny traded a recovered laptop for help spreading Marcus's father's story on social media. They met with a street artist who created a mural of Ryan Chen on a downtown wall, depicting him as a guardian angel watching over factory workers. They connected with community organizers, immigrant rights groups, and grassroots activists, all people whose lives had been touched, however distantly, by Ryan Chen's quiet acts of kindness over the years. Marcus had always known his father was successful, but he'd never understood the true measure of his impact. The factory worker who'd been able to send her daughter to college because Ryan Chen had personally paid for her scholarship. The janitor whose medical bills had been mysteriously covered by an anonymous donor after a workplace accident. The immigrant programmer who'd been sponsored for citizenship when other companies had turned him away. Danny orchestrated it all with the precision of a seasoned campaign manager. People got short memories, he explained as they huddled over a borrowed laptop in a 24-hour diner. But everybody remembers kindness. We just gotta remind them. The story went viral, not because of the money. Though a crowdfunding campaign Danny set up raised $200,000 in the first 48 hours, but because of what Ryan Chen represented. In a world that felt increasingly cold and transactional, here was a CEO who'd treated people like they mattered. The hashtag Save Ryan Chen trended nationally. News outlets picked it up. Celebrities shared it, but Marcus barely noticed. He spent his days between the hospital and the streets with Danny, and somewhere in those exhausting, terrifying hours, something shifted. He started seeing the city differently. The homeless woman who always sat by the library wasn't just a fixture. She was Margaret, a former teacher who'd lost everything in a fire. The guys who hung around the corner store weren't threats. They were veterans struggling with PTSD in a system that had abandoned them. Danny never asked for anything. He worked tirelessly, sleeping maybe 3 hours a night, coordinating volunteers, managing the social media accounts, connecting with journalists. When Marcus asked him why, Danny just shrugged. "Your dad saw my mom when nobody else did," he said simply. Time to pay it forward. 2 weeks in, something remarkable happened. A pharmaceutical executive in Boston, moved by the campaign, offered to provide the experimental treatment at cost. A Swiss clinic agreed to expedite Ryan Chen's admission. Medical transport was arranged. The community had raised enough money to cover everything, with donations still pouring in. But by then, Marcus had learned something more valuable than any treatment could provide. On the day before his father's medical transport to Switzerland, Marcus sat with Danny on the hospital roof, watching the sun set over Seattle's skyline. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. "After. When my dad gets better." Danny was quiet for a long moment. "Same thing I always do. Survive." "No," Marcus said firmly. He'd been thinking about this for days. "That's not enough. Not anymore." He turned to face Danny fully. "My dad always said the measure of a man isn't what he builds, it's what he gives. You gave me hope when I had none. You taught me that kindness isn't about money or power, it's about seeing people. Really seeing them." Marcus pulled out a notebook he'd been carrying. Inside were pages of ideas, sketches, plans. "When Dad gets better, we're starting something. A foundation. For kids like you. Real help, not just handouts. Job training, education, housing assistance. And you're going to help run it." Danny laughed, but there was something wet in his eyes. "I'm a street kid, Marcus. I didn't even finish middle school. You organized a nationwide campaign in 2 weeks with a broken phone and pure determination," Marcus countered. "You understood people and networks and strategy better than any adult I've ever met. You just needed someone to believe in you the way you believed in saving my father." The tears came then, for both of them. Danny tried to hide his face, but Marcus grabbed his hand. This boy who'd been a stranger 2 weeks ago, who'd become the brother he'd never had. "Please," Marcus said, echoing his own desperate words from that rainy night. "Please save yourself. Let me help." 3 months later, Ryan Chen walked out of the Swiss clinic cancer-free. The treatment had worked beyond anyone's expectations. He returned to Seattle to find his son transformed, harder in some ways, softer in others, with a clarity of purpose that took Ryan's breath away. The Chen Foundation for Urban Youth launched 6 months later, with Danny Rodriguez as its first youth director. They started small, a shelter program, job training workshops, educational grants. But it grew, fed by the same grassroots energy that had saved Ryan's life. Marcus worked alongside Danny every step, learning from the boy who'd learned from the streets, who'd learned from a CEO who'd learned the most important lesson of all, that every person matters. On the anniversary of that rainy night, Marcus and Danny stood before the street art mural, now a protected landmark, that had started everything. Someone had added new elements. 2 boys, one in expensive clothes, one in rags, shaking hands beneath a sky that was breaking from storm into sunlight. "You know what's crazy?" Danny said. "I thought I was so different from you. Street kid versus rich kid. But we were both just scared children who needed saving." Marcus smiled. "And we saved each other." That, Ryan Chen would later say, was the real miracle. Not his recovery, though he was grateful for every sunrise. Not the foundation, though it would go on to help thousands. The miracle was 2 boys from different worlds discovering the simple, revolutionary truth that had been there all along. That kindness isn't a transaction, compassion isn't conditional, and sometimes the person who looks like they need saving the most is actually the one who'll save you. The rain began to fall again, soft this time, washing the city clean. And 2 boys who'd become brothers stood together, ready to change their corner of the world, one act of kindness at a time.